submission to the House of Commons Committee examining Bill C-11, you stated, Internet streaming services are simply not broadcasting. A level playing field between over-the-air broadcasters and online streaming services is illusory. Can you further expand on this statement? Do you see Bill C-11 as an attempt to regulate the Internet? And if so, what do you see as the primary consequences of attempting to enact a bill whose primary objective, as you described it, is illusory?
The essential question. I'm going to refer it in a moment to Len Censorship, whose ideas are more precise than mine, but I would simply say that the Internet establishes a worldwide market in programming, video, and sound, and everything else. It exists. It is the main and real thing in the world today. That the closed world of Canadian broadcasting is a national-based industry with extensive regulation to protect it from competition. This competition has arrived, and essentially Bill C-11 is a scheme to try to make things that are utterly different somehow give them the same regulatory treatment. The Internet does not really need regulatory treatment, and the broadcasting system needs to adapt to the Internet, not the Internet to the Broadcasting Act. I pass it over to Len Censorship for further precision.
Thank you, Tim. First, with respect to the idea, this whole notion of a level playing field, as we said in our submission, the concept is a myth. The Internet and traditional broadcasting are fundamentally different markets, and C-11 does not foresee a level playing field. It would not, for example, extend to online undertakings, the kinds of market and content rights protections that apply to existing broadcasters, and nor should it. And it appears also not to have taken into account the impact on traditional broadcasters of actually requiring foreign undertakings to compete with them for the most highly cultural, sensitive, expensive, and subsidized Canadian content. In that sense, Bill C-11 kind of turns on its head decades of broadcasting policy by requiring foreign entities to compete with Canadian broadcasters. The other thing you asked about why it's so problematic. C-11 reflexively applies to audio and video on the Internet, which is arguably the most dynamic engine of innovation, competition, opportunity, and economic growth and creativity. It applies to that engine a policy and regulatory framework that were designed for 1950s radio and television. And then C-11 leaves it to the CRTC to determine what online entities will be regulated, whether by category or by individual streamer. So in that sense, it's the CRTC, not Parliament, that will determine the scope of regulation and therefore the extent of intervention in the Internet market and Canadians' freedom to access the content of their choice. The amendments we're proposing are intended to mitigate those negative impacts of the bill.
Thank you. My last question has to do with the CRTC chairman who came before this committee a while ago and was asked the question by Senator Wallin whether Bill C-11 was not regulating user content indirectly by compelling the platforms to do it. To that specific question, the commissioner responded that you are right, quote unquote. What do the witnesses, and anyone is free to answer this, see as likely the outcome of this? And how do you see user creators ultimately responding to this in their everyday activities, if you can give us specific examples?
Well, I'll speak from the experience as the CRTC commissioner at the time we dealt with whether the Internet ought to be broadcasting back in 2009. Essentially, as the bureaucracy seeks to fill up the last cubic inch of its regulatory authority with regulation. And the tendency over time is for regulation to get more minute, more comprehensive, more exhaustive, and more thorough. So if the possibility can be foreseen now that the internet will be regulated as to content, you may be certain that it already regulates as to speakers, who shall speak under what conditions, and it externalizes some of the censorship to the Broadcasting Standards Council, but it still regulates content. And we can imagine a future quite easily where this regulation of content is more specific to individuals, more specific to what people might want to say, and more exhaustive and comprehensive than it is now. Over to you, someone else.
If I may
jump in.
Okay, Len, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. If I were a producer of a digital-first creator of user-generated content, looking at this legislation, I would be looking at choosing to upload my content from outside Canada. I would be looking at contemplating ways in which to avoid the kind of regulation that we're talking about. And as was said before, I mean, the notion that user-generated content is excluded is overtaken by all of the exceptions to the exclusion. Essentially, if you make any money, either directly or indirectly, from your user-generated content through any social medium, you are potentially regulated under this act. So, you know, if you are a Lily Singh or one of the many Québécois or Québécoises artists creating for social media, you might be looking at finding a way to make sure that your stuff is uploaded from outside Canada. That's one thing. And that is a significant impact on the future creativity of this country. You know, this piece of legislation really is intended to favor incumbent broadcasters and those traditional independent producers who supply subsidized content to them. It really was not conceived with the creators, digital first creators, who are generating in the thousands, generating revenues and audiences worldwide outside the framework of the Canadian content subsidized supply management system. Over to someone else.
Mr. Lawford, you want to...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll say that this is a correct answer for Senator Wallen, and in our view, it's gaslighting users to say, you're not regulated, but your programs are. It's like saying to a guitarist, well, you're not regulated, but you can't use your guitar. So what can we do about that? My concern is if it's left in, there will be proceedings, will take a number of years at CRTC, but they may have regulations which get into things like what's appropriate speech. They may get into things like how successful a station is, or whether there's some sort of political bent that is not in favor at that time. It's possible, but we will have to, in the meantime, recommend to users of YouTube that they self-censor, and I think they will do it even without our recommendation. So that would be my concern.